네, 여러분 안녕하십니까?
Ladies and gentlemen,
평화 포럼에 오신
this is the PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022. I'd like to extend my welcome to all of you.
두 번째
This will be the second session on peace and public diplomacy. My name is Kim Yinhay. I'll be your mistress of ceremonies. I know that it's very cold outside,
한번 감사 인사.
so thank you to all of our guests who are in attendance with us today. And also thank you to all of our online participants for being with us.
여기까지 고스란히
We would like to try to do our best to make sure that you also feel the passion here in this room. I'd like to ask you to stay with us until the end. This is the second session on peace and public diplomacy. We'll be touching upon the 140th anniversary of the Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882
대한민국이
and strategies for peace on East Asia.
기초가
The Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882 was a basis for robust development of Korea. We're going to touch upon the significance of the treaty and also look at strategies forward for East Asian peace. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is the Secretary General of the Association of the 140th anniversary of the Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882. I'd like to hand over the microphone to Secretary General Moonyoung.
평창 평화 포럼 2022년
I would like to welcome you all to PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022.
기념사
And I would like to mention that it's a great pleasure for the Association for the 140th anniversary of Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882 to be a part of this event. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity for giving us our association to take part. As you are very well aware, 2022 is a critical year.
3월 9일 날
As you know, on March 9th, we will be holding the 20th presidential elections. And in that elections, we will be electing the leader that would be
날이 되고
leading Korea for the following 5 years and to enable peace on the Korean Peninsula. And May 22nd is the 140th anniversary
제네럴 셔먼
of the U.S. Korea diplomatic relations. It's true that in 1866, with the German Sherman incident, we've started off to build a relationship, and it was May 22nd, 1882, where at Jaemulpo,
정부와 또
the government of Joseon and the U.S. has forged an agreement, a treaty.
24일은
And it was August 24th when Korea and China
30년이 되는 날이 되기도 합니다.
forged diplomatic ties, and in 2022 it will be the 30th anniversary of the ties. But unfortunately, due to the conflicts between the U.S. and China for supremacy is intensifying, and we believe that Korea may be sandwiched between these two countries, which may lead to many challenges for Korea.
코비드
In addition, due to COVID-19,
세계 경제가 전체적으로 어려움을 겪고
the global economy is struggling, and it's true that our society is also hindered in many ways.
다가오면서
And in addition, we have the fourth industrial revolution
가야 할 시점에
just around the corner, meaning that it's important to craft out the right way forward. We still have the North Korean nuclear issue pending,
다시
and we're at a very challenging situation.
한미
So I believe that it's important to once again review our past footsteps and also devise a way forward as we meet the 140th anniversary of the Korea-U.S. Treaty.
만들어가고
So
우리 대한민국
we want to understand how we should manage and develop the ROK-U.S. relations, and also understand what kind of diplomatic efforts will help us achieve peace as well as unification on the Korean Peninsula. And in addition to that, we have many neighboring states, including China, Japan, Russia. So along with the U.S., how will we be able to usher in peace in Northeast Asia is also something that we would like to discuss today. We invited many prominent speakers for our session. We have former Minister of Foreign Affairs and also professor at Seoul National University.
우리나라의 최고의 국제 정치 경제학
Not only that, he is a
초반에
guru in politics and economy in Korea. In the 1990s, I was reviewing the World Politics Journal, and I read his dissertation in the journal, and I was greatly moved. So it was 30 years back. So in terms of international politics and economy, once again, we have our great prominent scholar as well as former minister, Professor Youngkwan, and he will be reviewing our past history with the U.S. and also give us some insights on the future. Next, we have Dr. An Yinhay, and she's studying in the U.S., and I will be going into some more specifics right before her presentation, but she is truly the prominent person in terms of international relations.
교수님, 사실 저는 안인혜 박사님은
Dr. An Yinhay, I think, and I thought would be the very first women minister of foreign affairs.
교수님,
So thank you very much for joining us, and she will be giving her comments on Professor Yoon's presentation and add also some of her insights to our comments. And in terms of military affairs between the ROK and the U.S., I would like to invite Professor Kim Jong-Soo. He was also with the Military and Security Institute, and he is also a very well-known expert in terms of military affairs.
연구하시고
And
활발히
we also have
중견 학자십니다.
a scholar, a seasoned scholar who has a lot of information, a lot of insight on what's happening on the field in terms of Korea and China. So it's Professor Jaeduk, a very young and promising scholar, and he will also be providing us with his views and comments.
장관님은
So then, let me first invite Minister Youngkwan,
발제를 한번 같이
and we would like to listen to his presentation. And you will have 25 minutes. Of course, we should spare you much more time than that. But considering the allotted time for this session, we would like to offer you 25 minutes for your presentation. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction.
함께
I would like to thank
자리하신
Dr. Moonyoung for the warm introduction, and of course, I would also like to greet all my colleagues here. I know that it is very cold outside,
또
so I would like to thank all the guests who are in attendance here today, as well as all the participants who are joining us online as well.
2018년 평창 올림픽에서
In 2018, we had the PyeongChang Winter Olympics, and we had the spirit of peace
키워나가기 위해서
at that moment. And now we have this PyeongChang Peace Forum that was done as a way to uphold the legacy of the PyeongChang Winter Olympics. I would like to thank everyone who has worked tirelessly to that end, the people of Gangwon-do and the Korean Christian Legacy Foundation. Thank you very much for all of your efforts. As you know, the Korean Peninsula is surrounded by major powers,
미국이라는 대국들로
China, Russia, Japan, and across the Pacific, there is the United States. All of these neighboring major powers have continued to engage in power competition over the Korean Peninsula, such as the continental powers of China, Russia, and oceanic powers as Japan and the U.S. And this competition has played itself out on our history as well. The chorus relationship has continued to change over history. Now I'd like to also take a look at where it will go in the future. Ever since the establishment of diplomatic ties between the two states, 140 years have passed. This can be broken down into 4 different eras. The first era took place beginning in 1882, when we signed the treaty, until 1910, when there was the
열강 간의 경쟁이 동아시아의
Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty of 1910. At the time, major powers of the West
서구 국제법
intensify their competition in the East Asian theater, and
1990
the order, the Sino order, was switching to a Western order based on international law. There was a Sino-Japanese War of 1903
조선은 미국이
and the
조선의 독립을 지원
Japanese-Russian War of 1904, and all these victories gave Japan a lot of confidence.
통상 이익을 추구하는데
Joseon at the time, or Korea, wanted the United States to take a more active role in supporting Joseon's independence. However, the United States did not. It was very passive in pursuing their trade interests. And in the end, what happened with Great Britain happened here in East Asian theater, and that Korean Peninsula became colonized by Japan. However, despite these difficult political situations, there was one positive event that unfolded, which is that many American missionaries who came to the Korean Peninsula since the 1880s have built hospitals and churches and schools. And these missionary activities have spread news of the gospel on the Korean Peninsula. After the independence of Korea, or liberation of Korea, on August 15, 1945, the U.S. military set up its stations here in Korea. Korea's relations were restored, and this is the beginning of the second era. The second era lasted from 1948 all the way to 1950 when the Korean War began, but this was a confusing time for both of us. In the end, the Korean Peninsula was divided due to an agreement between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The Japanese army was demilitarized, and the 38th parallel, which was drawn as a temporary line, became a permanent division line. After the South Korean government was established on August 15, 1948, the U.S. commitment for defense of Korea was not that strong. In fact, the U.S. Secretary of State Acheson in January 12, 1950, at the National Press Club speech said that the U.S. Pacific Defense Line would include the Aleutian Islands, such as Japan, Okinawa, Philippines, and in that he left out Korea. Despite these confusing times, however, one important thing to remember was that at the time, the national identity of the Republic of Korea became closer and were founded on the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the market economy. So as you can see, the first era of the Korea's relationship in that history was founded on disinterest of the U.S., and then there was a confusing time in the second era. But in the third era, this was when the Korean War broke out in 1950. This era lasted until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and this is the third era. In this era, there was a Cold War, as you know, that played out between the Freedom Front and the Communist Front. This was when the Korea's alliance developed into a military alliance. In 1950, Kim Il-sung received support and approval from Stalin and Mao Zedong to attack South Korea. However, although Stalin and Kim Il-sung thought that the U.S. would not intervene, President Truman decided to militarily intervene in the process, and according to the resolution of the UN Security Council, decided to comprise UN troops and defend Korea. In the three-year war, there were 37,000 American soldiers that fell, comprising a total sacrifice of 54,000. On October 1st, 1953, the ROK-U.S. Mutual Defense Agreement was signed, which was an institutional mechanism for cooperation under the KRINS alliance. During the Cold War, the KRINS alliance was primarily military in nature. It was founded on the military alliance because of the security threat of the DPRK. Within this framework of security of the KRINS alliance, the ROK was able to achieve unprecedented economic growth. In fact, according to the World Bank statistics, in 1960, Korea's per capita GDP was $158. In 1991, this increased 48-fold to $7,637. And at the same time, there was political development made as well. In 1987, there was a protest for democracy. In the 1970s, the Third Republic. In the 1980s, the authoritarian rule. All of this came to a close, and Korea was able to establish an institutional framework for democracy. The fourth era of the KRINS alliance and the development of the KRINS alliance history lasted from the end of the Cold War in 1991 to the current era, the post-Cold War KRINS alliance. This is when Korea's alliance continued to expand as a comprehensive alliance, and this is a reflection of the fact that Korea's national standing has been enhanced and its role has also improved. For example, on June 30th, 2007, the KRINS FTA was signed. This was a direct outcome of the economic growth of South Korea. In fact, the ROK became the seventh most important trading partner of the U.S. The KRINS alliance developed from beyond a military alliance to an economic alliance as a more comprehensive alliance.
것을 넘어서서
And Korea and the U.S. are not just focused on DPRK. They're engaging in different cooperative relationships for peace and security elsewhere in the world, including Middle East and West Asia. And the relationship has evolved. Korea is not just being a protectorate of the U.S., it's not being protected only by the U.S., and that we are now engaging in a mutually beneficent and beneficial chorus relationship.
화해 협력을 위한
The Cold War struggle it remains to this day on the Korean Peninsula. However, there are still efforts for reconciliation. ROK-U.S. measures for the Han people community and unification that was announced in September of 1989 provided a phased, step-by-step approach towards unification. And since then, other administrations, such as the Kim Dae-jung administration, attempted to pursue policies for inter-Korean reconciliation. These efforts were meant to try to create an organic growth engine towards peace and unification, and these were very significant efforts indeed. It would be similar to what happened in Germany when Adenauer Prime Minister's Christian Democratic Party engaged in a pro-Western policy, and ultimately this was also led to the pursuit of the Westpolitik of Willy Brandt. In the end, these efforts led to a base for unification. However, in West Germany, these two policies led to a synergy effect and ultimately led to unification, whereas in Korea, there is a continued mutual confrontation regarding whether we should protect the Han people or go towards an alliance. As you can see, the chorus relationship has gone through a disinterest period and a confusion period after independence, military alliance after the Cold War, and a comprehensive alliance in the post-Cold War era. We've seen 4 eras. Over the past 140 years, the chorus relationship has continued to grow and evolve. Korea's national standing and international standing over the world have increased, and this has become a very important growth engine, allowing for a more horizontal, mutually beneficial relationship for Korea and the U.S. And Korea's role and contribution have become more increased in the U.S. and the international society of high expectations for the ROK. Korea has to become more of a player in the future in the Korean Peninsula and in the international society as well. So now we'd like to look at what we have to do in terms of developing chorus relationship further.
Prior to this, it is necessary to look at the reality of today's international politics that chorus relations are facing. It can be said that the core of the current international political situation is the intensified competition between the U.S. and China. The U.S., which has been isolating China since the Korean War, pursued a dramatic change in its diplomatic strategy during the Vietnamese War in the early 70s. This new turn was focused on improving relations with China, allowing China and the Soviet Union to compete with each other, and the United States to gain in between. It was a strategy aimed at taking control of a country by utilizing others in the group, and this was to maintain the international influence of the U.S., which had been weakened after the defeat in Vietnam. At that time, the Nixon administration expected that if the U.S. embraced China and continued exchanges and cooperation, China would eventually converge toward Western democracy. Since then, China has achieved rapid economic growth. China's GDP, calculated at market exchange rates in 1960, was only 11% of that of the U.S. Then it caught up to 74% in 2021. If you go into past history or past world history, countries with increased economic power typically pushed ahead further, wanting to strengthen their political and military influence, and China was no exception. For example, China, which was cooperative with the Western world by following Deng Xiaoping's strategy of Taoguan or hide one's capacities and bide one's time, has shifted to an aggressive stance after the 2008 global financial crisis that originated in the U.S. Meanwhile, while challenging the U.S.-led international order in all parts of the world, it ran against the U.S. Against this backdrop, the U.S., which had previously expected that China would become westernized and democratized, found there really wasn't anything to expect in that regard and reached a bipartisan agreement that embracing China would no longer be meaningful. In the end, the Trump administration's policy of competition with China began in earnest, and the Biden administration followed suit. And as a result, the competition and confrontation between the U.S. and China is taking place in many fields. Diplomatically, the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy and China's One Belt, One Road strategy are in conflict. On the military front, the possibility of crises in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan is increasing. Economically, the two countries are forming independent supply chains while weakening the past network of interdependence between the U.S. and China. In the technology front, China, which dreams of world domination and high tech with their Made in China 2025 policy, is running into the U.S., which is trying to prevent this from happening. With respect to ideology, China is trying to spread the authoritarian Chinese model abroad, and the U.S. is trying to stop this through solidarity with countries of democracy and its allies. So, South Korea is in a difficult situation as relations between its ally, the U.S., and China, which has deep economic ties with Korea, deteriorate. How should Korea respond in this situation? And how should Korea-U.S. relations be managed? In answering these questions, there are prerequisites that must be considered. First, geopolitical factors that have had a profound influence on the fate of the Korean Peninsula since the end of the 19th century or even before that are deeply affecting the current situation on the Korean Peninsula. Among the large powers surrounding Korea, China, and Russia, or former Soviet Union, were hostile parties to the Korean War, and Japan was the country that colonized Korea. China and Japan also have territorial and historical disputes with Korea. Under these circumstances, the United States will be able to act as a guarantor of stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. In the past, the United States turned its back on South Korea's demands at the end of the Korean War, but is now working the other way around, actively trying to strengthen Korea-U.S. relations. Second is the existence of North Korea. It is a sad reality that the North Korean security threat continues even though the Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. The ROK-U.S. alliance is an essential tool to realistically respond to these security threats. And what is more desirable is for the two countries to become partners through the ROK-U.S. alliance to resolve security threats such as the North Korean nuclear issue and to establish lasting peace between the two Koreas. And this can be said to be the core task of Korea's diplomacy with the U.S. in the future. Third, the national identity of the Republic of Korea is based on the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and a market economy that have been sown in the process of establishing new Korea-U.S. relations since 1945. Considering these points, I think the future of the ROK-U.S. alliance should be designed in the following direction. First, considering Korea's national identity, I think Korea should more actively cooperate with the Biden administration's democratic value diplomacy. For the Korean people, since 1945, democracy has been and was the cause of their political life. People sometimes forget the value of oxygen, but only realize its value when it becomes scarce. Democracy has already become something like oxygen to Koreans. This should be considered as a constant in Korean foreign policy, and any future diplomatic strategy should avoid making choices that would negatively affect the functioning of Korea's democratic political system. Second, Korea is no longer a poor developing country. As of 2020, it is the world's 10th largest economy, 9th in export volume, a semiconductor powerhouse, 8th in terms of military power, 10th in terms of defense spending, and second in soft power portrayed by its culture and image.
한편으로 자랑스러운
On one hand, it is something to be proud of, but on the other hand, it also means that we have to contribute that much to the global society. I believe that noblesse oblige applies not only at the individual level, but to some extent also in international relations.
지구촌의
Therefore,
기후변화,
Korea should make a more active contribution in various fields such as tackling the global pandemic, climate change, and development cooperation. And it is necessary to cooperate with the U.S. as a partner in these domains.
셋째, 경제 및 기술
Third,
분야에서도 한국은
Korea should deepen cooperation with the U.S. in economic and technological fields as well. Through this, it is necessary to strengthen Korea's industrial competitiveness and capabilities in the high-tech sector.
반도체,
Korea already possesses world-class technology in the fields of semiconductors and batteries. However, it would be desirable to enhance competitiveness
한미 산업
through Korea-U.S. industrial cooperation in other high-tech domains such as bio, AI, and 6G.
마지막으로 군사협력 분야에
Lastly, there is the field of military cooperation. While cooperation in necessary areas should continue, South Korea should suggest to the U.S. to be cautious about expanding the target of the ROK-U.S. alliance from North Korea to China. As we saw earlier, due to geopolitical specificity, whenever a military clash between great powers on the Korean Peninsula occurred, Koreans suffered tremendous hardship. The Sino-Japanese War, the Russia-Japanese War, the division, and the Korean War are examples of such cases. American policymakers
특수성과
lack understanding of Korea's historical and geopolitical peculiarities and difficulties. Therefore, bettering their understanding on these matters and eliciting cooperation is an important task for diplomacy with the U.S. in the future.
협력을 통해
As such, through cooperation in all of these fields, we need to instill in the U.S. confidence and conviction regarding the ROK-U.S. alliance. Based on deep mutual trust, the U.S. should be encouraged to take a more proactive approach in resolving the North Korean nuclear issue and establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. has to deal with various world conflicts with many countries, and as a result, there is not enough room for the U.S. to pay attention to Korean Peninsula matters, and I think the North Korean nuclear issue is now in a similar situation. However, North Korea
발사에 대한
hinted
모라토리움을
at abandoning its moratorium on nuclear testing and long-range missile launches earlier this year, and perhaps
가장 급한
the most pressing diplomatic issue after the new government takes office in South Korea in May will be North Korea. I hope that the ROK-U.S. alliance will overcome these challenges and become a cornerstone of peace on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia. Thank you.
네.
Thank you very much, Minister Youngkwan, for your remarks.
140년 된 이 한미
He went over the history of KOREA's relations over the past 140 years and broken them down into 4 different stages, and also looked at the current status right now for the KOREA's alliance and where we need to go in the future for Korean diplomacy. He looked at different areas that we have to consider, first of all.
이런
And lastly,
제안을 해주셨습니다.
gave some proposals and suggestions as to the direction of Korean policy going forward.
30년, 40년 연구하고 이렇게
I've been researching this area for the last 30, 40 years, and I was able to feel that
쉽고
the greatest masters and the greatest thinkers, they have the tendency of keeping their speeches short, but very insightful, and also easily accessible,
깊이가 있고 울리는
with much depth and resonance.
제언을 해주셨습니다.
He has given us much in-depth analysis and excellent suggestions. So if you have the opportunity to take a read
한 번 더
of his remarks, that would be very helpful. And also, if you would like to
아마 큰 도움이
listen to his speech again on YouTube, that would be much helpful for all of you as well. Now we'd like to move into our discussion session.
토론해 주실 분은 한국 국가
We'd like to turn to our first discussant, the first panelist, which is Dr. Kim Jong-Soo at KRINS.
한국외
Dr. Kim Jong-Soo
국가를 졸업하시고요.
studied political science at Tufts at HUFS and also received his doctorate at Cincinnati University. Came back to Korea, worked at the Defense Institute,
정년 퇴직하시고
where he retired
국자였죠. 국방연구
and where he was a chair professor.
또 미국 연구실
He was
안보전략
head of research in U.S., was also the director of the Security Institute.
정책 보좌관을
He was also the political attaché, the aide to the Minister of National Defense, and he has
되시겠습니다.
expertise in far-ranging areas. We'd now like to invite Dr. Kim Jong-Soo. Please give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
박사님 10분 감사합니다.
Yes, Dr. Kim, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
평화공동외교 세션 2에서
To the second session on peace, public diplomacy,
40년에 지금하여 제하의 발제에 대한 지성토론
we've heard the presentation by Professor Yoon on the 140th anniversary of Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882 and strategy for peace in the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. Thank you very much for the presentation as well as the invitation. And as panelist of this session and as the designated discussant for the presentation, I hope that I can make my contributions. You can see that the presentation has classified the U.S.-Korea relations in 4 phases. It involved various fronts, including throughout the 140 years. And throughout the 140 years, the speaker assessed that we've been seeing some development in the relations. And the presenter, a master of international political economy, believed that if we look at the 140 years, the present and the past doesn't seem that much different, but we're seeing a change which has to do with the intensifying competition between the U.S. and China. It's true that it's not much different from 140 years ago, and assessed by the speaker, the U.S. and China, which participated in the Korean War on June 25th, are once again competing for supremacy on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia, and furthermore around the world. And he's also mentioned about the competition and confrontation between the U.S. and China in many fields. So in diplomatically speaking, the confrontation between the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. and the One Belt, One Road strategy of China, and also on the crises in South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. And in terms of the economic areas, 2 countries are forming independent supply chains while weakening past network of interdependence. And ideologically speaking, expansion of authoritarian Chinese model abroad, and the U.S. trying to stop that. So with regard to this, I think that it's important to understand there are 3 particular factors that was mentioned in terms of his analysis. So the first has to do with the geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective. The U.S. is trying to strengthen relations in terms of geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective with not only Korea but also with Japan, Australia, India, and Southeast Asian countries. And also with regard to North Korea and the North Korean regime, we support the management of security threats such as general military threats, including nuclear weapons and missiles, through continuous strengthening and deepening of the comprehensive ROK-U.S. alliance, that is the management of the armistice and the establishment of permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. And lastly, in terms of human rights and democracy and market economy, it's true that the Republic of Korea with such identity is trying to develop a value alliance, and I think that there's a lot of potential there. And the speaker has made 4 proposals. First, that we should be more actively involved in the Biden administration's democratic values diplomacy. And second is that in various areas, including the pandemic, climate crisis, and development cooperation, we should be strengthening our partnership with the U.S. and actively contributing in that regard. And third, to intensify our collaboration in economy and technology. And also that in addition to the sustained military collaboration that we have, we need to be cautious to make sure that the target of the ROK-U.S. alliance from North Korea to China should be something that would be taken with prudence. And the very last proposal is probably the most difficult because you can see that we're seeing intensified relations between the U.S. and China. It's accelerating, and we believe that this is to continue. And some say that we would be seeing a coming of the new Cold War, just like we can see in Ukraine and in Taiwan. You can see that both the West and Eastern world
서로 패권 경쟁이 일어나는
may be engaging that fight for supremacy, and
많은 전문가
many experts say that it will be severely impacting security in Northeast Asia, and there are a lot of concerns from the media as well as the peoples. And due to such impact, we really need to understand what we should do going forward. And we can say that many experts have been debating this, and it's still continuing as we speak. So the first point that we would like to mention is that in terms of military spending, in 2025
2025년까지는
and until 2049, China will become number one and will be overtaking the U.S. So this was the forecast. And it was true that it was a reliable forecast. But then what's happening is China will not just be taking this route in a convenient fashion. Yeah, the U.S. is trying to keep check. So we'll be seeing confrontation between the two countries. So what should Korea do in such a situation? And I think that even right now and even afterwards, when we do have a new administration, this would be a key agenda item. So if I may go into specifics, the scenario of China's continuous economic growth and overtaking the U.S., maybe we have been thinking, or maybe we've been just taking this for granted. So then we really need to see what kind of difference in the Korean government's position would be necessary in this situation. So in this shift of order, what kind of decisions will we have to make? You can see that there are many concerns surrounding the Chinese order. So not only Korea, but also Japan, Australia, India, and other Southeast Asian countries are all engaging in a different type of hedging. I do know that Japan also is trying to engage in some sort of hedging in this process. So under how long and under what conditions can Korea continue to engage in such different hedging of these countries? And second has to do with North Korea. You can see that the nuclear missile threats of the North is gradually becoming visible. And recently, North Korea has been continuing on to enhance their sophistication of their nuclear capabilities. And you can see that we have to increase our military spending, our military power, and some people even think that we should possess nuclear power in response.
업체에 대한 여러 가지
So there's a lot of things that we have to look into to make sure that we stop the proliferation. So this is a direct threat to us, and if we do not solve this, it's going to get very difficult for the two Koreas, the relations between the two, and it will impact the relationship with the U.S. and China. And you can see that we do have
휴가 배치 반대한
there are specific what we call the three-pronged policy of the government, opposing the deployment of THAAD, the non-participation of the U.S.-led missile defense system, and opposing the promotion of the South Korea-U.S.-Japan trilateral alliance. So it was true that we had these three-no type of policy, but do you really believe that this is in line with national interest? So I would like to ask that question to you. Do you think that was the right decision? And then I do have another point, but maybe I will skip that point. And with regard to the conclusion that you've drawn, you've mentioned about three particular aspects: that we need to be more active with our relationship in the U.S., and we have to also cooperate further in North Korean nuclear issues, and also encourage the U.S. to take part actively in stabilizing peace in the Korean Peninsula. And with the new administration to come in May, you've mentioned that the most urgent task will be North Korean issues. And I, of course, could not agree more. So by setting my forecast and analysis, I would like to close this my comments, which is the following. May 22nd marks the 140th anniversary of the Treaty of 1882. Of course, it was the treaty between the Joseon Dynasty and the U.S.
관계는 1953년
We typically say that our relations started in 1953, 1954, because this treaty was between Joseon Dynasty and the U.S. But at any rate, it started off, well, if we think about the relations, it started off 150 years ago. But this 140th anniversary, of course, depending on the definition, may be slightly different. But I do want to say that this year is critical. So what should we do in this new year? And regarding the new administration, I know that there's a lot of advice given by many experts. And I also would like to extend my comments on that. What's important is that this intensifying competition for supremacy between the U.S. and China will intensify. It will be the same case in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Europe, and the alliance between China and Russia. We believe that all of that will intensify, and we'll be seeing a lot of media coverage on that. A lot of experts will be engaging in debate on these topics. So then what are we going to do going forward? Of course, there is no simple magic bullet to answer. It's about the process, it's about the direction, and if we do have the right direction set forth, I think that we would be able to reach or achieve the goal that was originally intended. So the competition for supremacy between the U.S. and China, if you think, even 140 years back, it was a power running against multiple countries, whether it be Russia or China. So we've been seeing these powers clash in the past, and we're seeing the very same situation or same phenomenon right now. So as mentioned in Ukraine, Russia and China, EU, UK and Germany, you can see that we have these confrontations between these two groups. And the reason why we need to zoom into the situation of Ukraine is because it will have a major impact on the Korean Peninsula and the inter-Korean relationship as well as in the international community. So if I may have the opportunity to give my advice, I think that it would be great if these relations will help us solve these challenges. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for your words, and thank you so much for keeping to the time. Thank you very much for keeping to the time, and we will now like to move on to Professor An.
Professor An Yinhay is a professor at the GSIS of Korea University. She studied at Yinhay Women's University and also studied at George Washington University in the U.S., where she received her PhD degree. She has also worked at the Korea Institute for Unification, and now she is at Korea University. Was also the president of the Korean Society for Political Scientists, and in Korea she studied China, so she is a China expert, and it is from that point of view that she would like to give her discussion points. Dr. An, we know that you have worked very hard on your discussion, so I will give you 15 minutes. So it's okay, you can I know that you have really prepared extensively for your remarks, so you can use enough time. Please welcome her with a big round of applause. Hello and thank you. I've just been introduced. My name is An Yinhay. I am at GSIS at Korea University. I don't know why Dr. Moonyoung has not mentioned that he and I used to work together at KINU for about 6 years, so we go a long way back. He is currently the Secretary General at the Association for the 150th anniversary of Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882. And it is this association that is hosting this very important session where we can have a chance to talk about a very timely topic. This is quite fortunate, and for me, it's a personal honor. I was the president in 2012 of the Korean Society of International Political Scientists. And I remember at the time where we oversaw an academic symposium on the Korea-U.S. establishment of diplomatic ties. And now it's been 140 years, so this is a very meaningful year for me as well. Professor Emeritus at Seoul National University, Dr. Youngkwan, gave us a very excellent breakdown of the last 140 years of KRINS relations, foreign policy, and how their interactions have evolved over the years. And he broke it down into 4 different phases, and this was very helpful. And because Dr. Kim Jong-Soo asked some very comprehensive questions in his remarks, I would like to ask some questions myself to Dr. Yoon, because he was also a Minister of Foreign Affairs. So because he was a policymaker, I would like to ask about 3 questions looking at the past, the present, and the future. It's true that I really prepared a lot for today's discussion. I was very eager and excited to come. And also, last year, in 1925, when Korea established diplomatic ties with China, I touched upon that commemorative milestone, and I've written a book. I published a book on that, which I wanted to bring today and share copies with everyone here. But in any case,
김영삼, 김대중, 노무현 정부.
I looked at the Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, Roh Moo-hyun, Lee Myung-bak,
때문에
Park Geun-hye, all of these different administrations that have come to pass that try to use this as an analytical tool to look at all of those different administrations and their policies, which is why I was very eager to come to today's session to give my contribution here, because this is an issue that is very close to my heart.
것에 있어서 그 윤영관 그 교수님께서도
I have to say that
경쟁이 굉장히 중요한 가장 그
Dr. Yoon has said that
이게 핫한 그
the competition with China is a very important keyword, and this is something that we have to consider when we look at Korea's relations and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So I would like to use this as a question, a base for my question.
또 지당 경제
We have democracy, market economy, human rights, and as you know, these are the values that the Chorus Alliance is founded on, and I agree that this Chorus Alliance is based on these values, and I agree that this is a values
소개를 하셨기 때문에
diplomacy, values alliance. The moderator said that I am a China expert, and it is with that in mind that I would like to say that at the Roh Moo-hyun administration, there were very much anti-U.S. sentiments that was widespread at the time.
정부에 있어서의 포용 정책을
So,
계승했다고 했지만은
Roh Moo-hyun said that he was upholding the inclusive spirits of the Kim Dae-jung administration, but as you remember, at the time there was quite a stalemate in the two Koreas. President Bush called the DPRK an axis of evil, and Korea at the time, I
모르겠습니다만은
think, went largely ignored, saying that he's an easy man or etc. This man, and in any case,
로서의 그 대접을 받으면서 했던가 하는
the ROK was not necessarily treated with a lot of respect back at the time.
관계에서의 어려움이 있었던 것
Oh, yes, there were some difficulties regarding our U.S. policy.
질문을 드리고 싶습니다.
I am asking this question because I understand that Minister Yoon was very active at the time because he was the foreign minister. I wrote a column around this time when I said that the DPRK, the biggest objective for the DPRK is to improve relations with the U.S., then have an easing of sanctions, and then have a normalization of ties.
북한은 미국이 신뢰하지 않는
To do that,
상대에 대해서는 관심이 없지 않을까.
the DPRK is not interested in engaging with dialogue with any partners that it thinks the U.S. does not trust, which is why at the time, under Roh Moo-hyun, when there was anti-U.S. sentiment, the DPRK saw that, and the DPRK was not very happy, and it did not attract them. Back then, Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan, I called him a strategist. He was really close to President Bush, and he let the world know of this.
그리고 엘비스 프레슬리 좋아한다고 노래도 부르고
He would sing Elvis Presley songs, saying that George Bush also loved those songs, etc.
납북자 문제를 내세워서
And there was that issue of abductees.
정상회담을 합니다.
Prime Minister Koizumi had two summits with the DPRK leader at the time, which did not continue on because of the abductee issue. But in any case, during that time frame, President Roh Moo-hyun was not able to hear any response from the DPRK, and there was no improvement of relations around that time.
그런 의미에서 본다면 당시에
So-
장관으로 따라갔던 아베도 그 고이즈미와
Later on, Abe, who went with Koizumi to some of these summits,
그러니까 북이
later on did the same thing, trying to improve relations,
아니었다.
but was not able to do so. And if we were to see this from that point of view,
됐습니다만
I know that this has been widely reported as well, but around that time, when you were the foreign minister, I know that there were these huge huge struggle between those people who called for the alliance and people who called for autonomy or independence. And I know that this was very difficult for you at the time because of all this conflict.
자주파. 물론 저는 동맹파였다고 이제
I believe that you were part of those people who were pro-Chorus Alliance, who were calling for a stronger U.S. alliance.
또 남북
So I was wondering,
한미 관계 한미 동맹을 굳건히 하는
do
것이
you think that
보완이 되고 오히려
it was helpful to have that strong
간의 그런
inter-Korean relations, perhaps strong inter-Korean relations?
국민들이 보기에 이런 그 충돌로
could have led to an easing of this conflict between those people who are calling for an alliance and those people who are calling for an autonomy or independence. Do you think that there might have been better ways to navigate the situation at the time?
로서는 그
The next comment that I would like to make is on the THAAD issue, but this is something that Dr. Kim Jong-Soo has already mentioned in his discussion points, but I would like to go a little bit deeper. Right now, the Korean presidential candidates
때문에 그런데요.
are talking about their different campaign pledges. I remember it to be about 2014 when there was that whole THAAD controversy at the time, and many people said that
총도 없었고
there was no request from the U.S. and there was no debate, there was no discussion, and there was no decision made before THAAD was deployed.
평가위원회 위원장을 맡고 있었기 때문에 여러
At the time, I remember that I was working as an advisor to the Minister of Unification. And so I was able to get a lot of different pieces of information. As a civilian, I knew that there was going to be a THAAD deployment. However, to China,
모성이라고 표현할 수 있어요.
Korea has said that this has not been decided, it is not a decided matter, etc. They say that Korea did this to do strategic ambivalence. But strategic ambivalence is something that you can do with allies, with partners that may trust you. But strategic reliability is something that we need to have first.
그 지적을
This is a point that I have continued to make since then.
사드가 배치되는 상황에서
So around that time, during the THAAD deployment,
미군과
this was U.S. budget, U.S. troops, U.S. assets, and U.S. facilities
배치했다는 겁니다.
were being protected by the THAAD anti-missile defense. And so,
무슨 명분으로
what was
이 미국의 사드 배치를 반대
the reason that that Korea could have used to oppose a THAAD deployment? In fact, there was really no way for Korea to oppose the deployment of THAAD. And if that was the current situation, then I think that Korea should have been more forthcoming and more honest about this. Tell China that this is a case. And this is what's going to happen because we have no other alternative. And we have to keep to this very principled approach.
겁니다.
Later on, they changed the location from military facilities to a civilian resort. And because of this, there was a lot of pressure placed on the ROK as well. And in this process, Korea lost its credibility.
근데 저는 당시에 중국은
I think at the time,
중단
China
쌍궤
was
동맹을 얘기를 했습니다.
promoting it was translated into the double track parallel, where China is saying that peace agreement and denuclearization should be promoted in parallel so that DPRK would come to the dialogue table. I think that this is quite true, frankly,
그 북한이
because DPRK is now insisting that it is a nuclear state.
뭐 얘기도
So if it's talking about disarmament without talking about a peace agreement.
서로 간에 그 논의가 될 수 있을까?
Can we really have discussions about denuclearization without all of this?
중국이 주장하는 쌍궤 병행을
China's promotion of a double-track parallel would have been something, it should have been something that Korea
받아주지 않을 수 없다 하는 그런
argued for and tried to persuade the U.S. to come around on. And I believe that should have been the policy stance that we have taken at the time so that we can ensure strategic reliability, as I mentioned before. Of course, philosophically speaking, ambivalence could have seemed to be more strategic.
이제 신뢰가 있다는 그 전제에서 얘기할 수 있다.
This, of course, should be founded on a foundation of trust and credibility. But that was unfortunately not the case. And now under the current administration, we often talk about mediatory diplomacy.
상대방에게
This is where we would have a balance and
역량이 그래도 조금 먹혀 들어갈 수 있을 때
think that we can have this mediatory diplomacy where we have a little bit of an edge. But can we really do that between the U.S. and China? Do we have that competitive edge between the two? Because in our effort to try to be a mediator, we might end up losing our bargaining power and losing credibility with both the U.S. and China.
하는 교량 역할을 하면서
So
대를 만들 수 있다.
perhaps we can be a bridging power, a bridging diplomacy.
사드 배치 문제에 대해서
And in that case, this THAAD deployment,
여기 장관
as the foreign minister, because he participated in the policy-making process, I was wondering the kinds of solutions that you might be able to present today. I was trying to elaborate on the context behind my questions. And the third is on something that we will look forward to in the future. Trump has talked about the Indo-Pacific partnership, and Joe Biden has expanded that to talk about Quad and Quad Plus.
일본 그리고 인도.
This would be the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan. With Quad Plus, they would try to incorporate Korea, Vietnam, etc. So it's a values alliance, but the objective for Quad is to put China in check.
COVID-19으로 무슨 백신
Because of COVID-19, China has countered this with vaccine diplomacy to try to increase their diplomatic prowess using vaccines, whereas the U.S. is talking about vaccine partnership. Early on, Korea needed vaccines, and the U.S. needed Korea's technology in semiconductors and elsewhere. So with Quad,
실질적으로 그 안에 반도체를 포함하는 그 신기술
there is semiconductors, technologies, vaccines, and climate change response. There are
들어가 있습니다.
working groups there within Quad. In fact, these working groups have already been installed within Quad.
반도체를 포함하는 신구
This means that
기술의
for new technologies, including semiconductors, the U.S. is trying to talk about all of these within a values alliance
중국과 이제 기술 격차를
without
뭐 이런
the inclusion of China. And by doing so, U.S. hopes to create a technological gap between China.
미국을 초월하는 최강대 국가가 되겠다는 그
China, however, is trying to have that China dream, wherein by 2025 we'll be able to outrun the United States. Right now, the Korean government
그 정확한 답
has not provided a clear answer regarding Quad or Quad Plus. And in the new administration,
미국으로부터의
it will continue to be pressured by the U.S. administration on joining Quad or aligning with Quad Plus and etc. So we would have to come up with a clear answer.
동맹과
Today, in your presentation, you talked about the Chorus Alliance and the Korea-China Strategic Partnership,
어떤 그 스탠스 입장을
the kind of stance that we have to balance between the two to try to maximize our national interests. This is really the single largest focus. It should be the focus of ours, and of course, this would be a very important message as received by the DPRK.
에서는 지금
When it comes to the DPRK,
체제를
we talk about the new Cold War.
자꾸 고립을 시키고
We are isolating the DPRK and
폐쇄 사회가
continuously trying to create this closed-off society.
그
The more we do so, DPRK's dependence on China will continue to grow.
그런 것에
And
대한
so,
그런 지혜를
Korea and the U.S. will have to be very closely aligned on this issue together. I would like to ask you for your wisdom on how best we can do that.
아주 날카로운
Professor An, thank you very much for the very sharp analysis that you've conducted and your excellent questions. Yes, she and I worked together at KRINS as a colleague. I'm sorry that you were
처음에 오셨을 때
upset that I did not mention that, but she was a China expert when she came to KRINS. And so I don't think that she had a very good understanding of North Korea at the time, but today in your remarks, when you talk about North Korea's diplomatic policy goals, that was really a very precise look at the DPRK. So I would like to ask you all to please take a read.
또 모든
In fact, if you come to our website, you can request assistance from us, and we will be able to share you copies of their prepared remarks. Dr. An gave some very sharp questions on the debate between those people who call for Chorus Alliance and calling for autonomy and independence, the clash between these opinions, and whether we
윤 장관님
missed that opportunity to try to improve relations with the DPRK. We'd like to ask Dr. Yoon to respond to these questions later on. And she also talked about strategic ambiguity.
하는 표현이
This is something that strategists often talk about, but she has said that strategic ambiguity is not going to work, that we need to work on strategic reliability, and this is what we have to work on, where we can be a reliable partner for the U.S. and for China. I think that is a very creative outlook and a very useful proposition.
발목 상대로 이렇게 발전하신 안인혜 교수님
I have seen that she has really tremendously grown as an excellent scholar over the past 30 years, and I'd like to pay tribute to you. We'll now move on to our last discussant.
활발하게 활동하시는 교수님이세요.
I would like to invite the next speaker, Professor Jaeduk from Wonkwang University and also the head of the Institute on Korea-China Politics and Diplomacy. He graduated from Sungkyunkwan University, majoring in Chinese language and literature, and also received this PhD in Beijing University. So he's truly an expert in this theme, and he's been studying the relationship between Korea and China. And not only that, he also ran a business in China. So he has a lot of experience and insight in both theory as well as on the field. So he's a very promising scholar, and he came all the way from Changsu. So I would like to give 10 minutes to Professor Choi. Please give him a big round of applause.
Yes, my name is Choi Jaeduk. I'm a professor at Wonkwang University.
허문영 사무총장님께서 소개해 주셨습니다.
Secretary General Moonyoung gave such a
제자로 만난
excellent introduction for me. He used to be my professor when I was at university, and I believe that was the reason why he asked me to come here.
짧고 쉽고
And Secretary General has said that Dr. Yoon's speech and presentation may have been short but concise and very insightful and deep. I don't know if I can match up to that. I will try to do my best.
4학년 2학기 때 제가
Minister Yoon,
대학원
I remember
기억이
taking your class when I was a fourth year, when I was a senior, and then I went on later on to graduate school because I was so inspired by your scholarship. I have to say that this is a great honor for me to be here.
미래 방향
Distinguished Professor Youngkwan, who has told us of his presentation on the past and the future of Korea-U.S. relations
발전사를
on the 120th anniversary of the Korea-U.S. Treaty of 1882. He has told us about the past and the future
것에 대해서
of the two countries. Thank you very much. And I really have to say that I deeply
발제문 중에서 아래와 같은
agree with many of what you said. In fact, these are some of the remarks that I truly deeply agree with. The first of which is that Korea has to be more active in cooperating with the values of diplomacy
두 번째는
based on diplomacy, based on democracy of the Biden administration. And secondly is that
다양한
the ROK must also make a more active contribution with the partnership of the United States in various areas such as the pandemic, climate change, and development cooperation. The third is that Korea must deepen its cooperative ties with the U.S. in its economy and the fields of technology.
군사 협력
Lastly is that we have to continue to sustain cooperation in military fields,
미국의
but
한미
that
타켓을
the Chorus Alliance
까지 확대하는 것에 대해서는 신중하자.
should not be necessarily expanded to include China
우리가
from
생각하는
North Korea.
거는 이렇게 대륙
And I agree that we have to be very careful
사회주의의 대척점
in that regard. I feel that right now we are seeing that many major nations are trying to become nationalists, and there was with that nationalist tendency that they looked at the Korean Peninsula. There were several U.S. DPRK summits
항미
and also several U.S.
내가 강화되고
DPRK China summits, and we understand that there's competition really rising
전략은
between Russia
군사
with the U.S. and China and
이것은 일본의
the U.S.
건강에 힘을 실어주고 있습니다.
This is also leading to more military escalation in Japan as well.
중화민족의 위대한 부흥,
China has said that they're going to achieve the China dream
공격적 외교와
and has been very aggressive in its diplomacy, trying to become a major power. And it is expected that they will continue to engage in this strategy going forward. These kinds of strategic change and the changes in the environment are very different.
협력적 분위기를
This cooperative relationship
조성하기 어려워졌다는
would be very difficult to try to create in this kind of current situation.
경쟁이
This means that the U.S.-China competition, once it intensifies, these structural
한반도 비핵
factors of the Korean Peninsula will come to the fore, and it will be difficult for us to try to create momentum for denuclearization.
리더십
The U.S. and China
문제뿐만이 아니라
are looking at not just leadership and economy, but also trying to create a supply chain,
그리고 군사적 긴장 및
military tension, geopolitical risk management, and they are investing a lot of energy into these different areas.
미중에게 한반도 문제가
Furthermore, for the U.S. and China,
대결에서
the Korean Peninsula is a way
우연이기 때문에
is not necessarily a priority for them, so which is why the Korean Peninsula is continuing to not be a priority for either of those countries.
통해서
There were two U.S. DPRK
좁혀지지
summits, and there was a stalemate out of this. It was difficult for them to see eye to eye. China supports CPRK, continues to provide economic support, and if that continues to happen, the U.S. will not get its wish fulfilled, that the negotiations for denuclearization will not occur.
이에서 그 윤영관 장관 교수님
This is why Professor Yoon, or Minister Yoon,
드리고자 합니다.
in his presentation, I have listened to it and I thought about three questions that I'd like to ask. There are these structural limitations on Northeast Asia. So my question is, what should the next Korean administration place its ultimate priority on?
보시고요. 두 번째는
And
이렇게 미중 경쟁이 장기화되고
secondly is that this U.S.-China competition is getting prolonged and there is lack of cooperation between U.S. and China. So in this,
잡기 위해서
for the Korean Peninsula issue to become a priority issue for U.S. and China, especially for the U.S., what are the conditions that are needed? The last and third question that I want to ask is that Korea is heavily reliant
30%가 넘습니다.
on the Chinese economy, about 25% or 30%, including the Hong Kong economy. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties with China as well.
발전시킨다는 전제하에
We have to have a comprehensive values alliance with the U.S. But what is going to be the future outlook for our alliance with China, in your opinion?
다음으로 발표 토론자는 개인의 의견을 좀 말씀드리고 싶습니다.
So now I would like to move on to talking a little bit about my own
영향을 미치고
personal opinions. Right now, the U.S.-China struggle for hegemony is really impacting the ROK as well.
관계가 매우
I believe
있는 것이기 때문에
that because our relationships are very organically tied to one another, that we have to look at not just the Chorus Alliance, but also our relationship with China as well.
미중 패권 경쟁 상황에서
In this struggle for hegemony between the U.S. and China, Korea is actually seen as a very important partner by both nations. And because we are a technological partner, we have strategic leverage. And in fact, our leverage has increased. Even under the COVID pandemic, we were able to have the most robust export record because of the export sales of semiconductors.
미중 패권 경쟁의 핵심인
The U.S. China are fighting over AI, robots, self-driving cars, the metaverse. All of these different technologies and semiconductors are necessary in this field. As we become a more futuristic society, those countries that have semiconductors and have the ability for mass production will continue to rise in standing.
때문입니다.
This is because we are so heavily reliant on semiconductors. Over the past 30 years, the United States, since the Cold War, was the only hegemon in the world, and it has established its own world order, and it was the leader of this global order. China saw economic developments in this same order.
따라서 그
Therefore,
한국을 포함해서 유럽, 인도, 아세안, 호주, 남미 국가들이
Europe,
미국은
Asia, South America, and elsewhere, they are engaging in security alliance with the U.S., economic alliance with China. This means that Korea is not the only country in this situation. But the change is our perspective and the perception of the hegemon competition and our over-dependence and our overestimation of the current alliance
예전
means
선택하는 잘못된
that we have to be very prudent. If we're not prudent, if we rush forward to take a side, then we might make a mistake. We are very organically integrated. The world is very organically integrated. And even in the COVID outlook, and even in the COVID pandemic, we're still very reliant on China. So we cannot be very dichotomous in our approach of our diplomatic policies.
이익에 따라서
Depending on the area of focus, countries are
가담하지 않고
taking different sides. This also means that we have to be very pragmatic. Human rights, climate change, international law, technology, global order. For all of these global challenges, we take some sides.
입장에 서지만
But for some universal values, we take other different sides. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that we have a very close economic integration with China, the economy, trade, tourism, infrastructure, etc. So it is realistically impossible for us to have a rapid decoupling with China. And European countries and other democratic nations
미국의 주장에 무조건 동의하지
are not also being 100% supportive of the U.S. argument to banish China.
오히려 안보적 위험에 직면하게 되는 것을 걱정하고
In fact, the European countries are
미중 경
worried that they might become isolated in this kind of rivalry. So the U.S. China rivalry could provide opportunities, but it also bears many risks.
저해하는 위험
Korea, once Korea's development could be hindered, and
대적적인 국가로 성장한다면
if Korea can, however, become a very attractive country in the fourth industrial revolution era, Korea can seem very attractive to both U.S. and China, and we can have a very good atmosphere.
협력을 위해서는요.
For the two Koreas' reconciliation and peace, Korea has to be very active in trying to persuade and convince U.S. and China. We have to provide some sort of card that the countries cannot say no to. So we have to try to create some kind of momentum in that regard.
미국의 가치 외교에 적극적으로
The Values Alliance is something that Korea has to very actively participate in, and this is a way for us to contribute to world peace. We also have to expand our cooperation with new northern and new southern countries so that ultimately in economic and diplomatic areas that we have to expand our focus. 30 years later, our next generation
전략적 환경을
will be living in Northeast Asia. We have to have the accountability to create a very safe Northeast Asian society. In the post-COVID era, with the U.S. China rivalry part 2, we have to be very pragmatic in trying to pursue national development. Thank you very much.
네, 최재덕 교수님 지금 아주
Thank you very much, Professor Choi. He is currently
위원회 전문위원
in the Northern
날카로운 질문 또 이렇게
Economic Cooperation Council under the President. So thank you very much for your remarks. We have heard from all of the different discussants.
세 분이
Dr. An, Dr. Kim, Dr. Choi, thank you very much for your questions. Now we'd like to ask all these questions which have been asked to Dr. Yoon. You can remain seated and just comfortably respond to the different comments that have been raised. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for all of your comments.
아주 날카로운
Thank you for those very keen and important questions.
저의 생각이나 이런 거를
And it really gives me great food for thought to develop the positions that I had with regard to this topic.
저는 그 말을 좀
And I would like to share with you some brief comments
하겠습니다.
as well as some responses with regard to your questions.
대한
So,
전제
first,
알려드리고 싶은 건
the
기본
point I would like to make before I do respond to the questions is that if you think about policy, I always think about the time variable or the temporal variable. In other words, we need to understand at what point in time do we stand, and in 5 years' time, what would the situation be like? So you always have to take that into account when we think of policy. So in other words, as is the same case for all politics, international politics is an organism that evolves.
거는 지금 이 시점에서의 제
So right now, at this point in time, considering the circumstance that we are living in, my response will be based off on that. So that would be the premise. Considering the time that we are in, my response would be as follows. So please keep that in mind, if you may. And I think that the following comment may be a response to most of the questions that you had. But when you think about the diplomatic strategy between the Korea and U.S., I do emphasize and did emphasize in my presentation that the ROK-U.S. alliance is critical, and that is my personal philosophy and my view, because I think we really need to make the calculation, because if we distance ourselves from the U.S., what will happen? Then we will be distanced from Japan as well, because the U.S. and Japan have a very steadfast relationship, a as allies, and in almost in every front, they are on the same page. They agree. So if we distance ourselves from the U.S., it will be the same case for us with Japan. So then we have China that would remain. So then, what about China? What kind of future vision does this country, China, have?
러시아의 그 푸틴이
Putin of Russia
영광을 되찾겠다.
said that he will be reliving the glory and honor of the Soviet Union. So in the same vein, I believe that Xi Jinping, in his mind,
중심의 그
the focus that he has
수직적인
is to
구축을 하겠다. 중국
put in place a vertical order of the world with China at the center. I believe that that's what he's pursuing. In other words, he is trying to pursue regional supremacy or hegemony. And in order to promote such strategies,
아시아에서 밀어내려고 하는
it is trying to push away the influence of U.S. in Asia. But you can see that
미국의 영향력을
we have South Korea.
시도를 하고 있다 하는 것이죠.
And you can see that it's trying to continue on to reduce or minimize the influence of U.S. So then, if we do have this distance with U.S. and Japan, as mentioned, we have China remaining in this equation. And we do need to take into account Chinese pursuits. And if you look at ideology and value, China has a completely different system with South Korea. Well, first off, it's not a democratic nation. It's more of an authoritarian type of country. And it's trying to export its authoritarian model around the world.
중국의 품으로 들어갔을
But if we, let's say, decide to side with China,
편안하게 그리고
what would it be like for the Korean people?
자존심을 지키는
And would we be able to maintain our national prestige, our sovereignty? Would we be able to do that?
뿐만 아니라
So what would happen is we may be isolated diplomatically speaking, and if that situation does occur,
노릇 주인
it may be the case where in the inter-Korean relations,
속에서
North Korea will try to act like the big brother because it already has a very long-standing relationship with China more than Korea, and it also possesses nuclear capabilities. So in this situation where Korea is distancing itself from the U.S. and Japan, North Korea will understand that we remain powerless, and it will try to run this discourse of inter-Korean
동맹이 중요하다라고 하는
matters. It will try to take it in their own hands and try to lead the process. So that's why I'm saying that the alliance is important. So based on that premise, with regard to the question by Dr. Kim,
지속적으로 경제 성장을 할 것이다.
I,
미국으로 추월할 것이다.
in terms of taking for granted that China will take the lead in the world economy and that it will outrun U.S., well, I do not take that for granted. There will be many variables and there may be very many fluctuations. We don't know what will happen, but the U.S.'s system has a great advantage, which has to do with unleashing the potential of the individuals into creative ideas and to graft that into industrial growth and development. If you look at the political system, it really enables that unleashing of individual potential. However, if you look at the Chinese authoritarian model, it just cannot do that.
기본적인
So in that aspect, the Chinese system does have its own inherent limitations. And as you are very well aware, it's a one-person run country, basically. So this is a very dangerous concept because the one and only leader, if he or she in some sense has the wrong policy in place, there is no break. There is no one that could put that policy in check. So once that happens, all of a sudden there may be a major collapse across the country with this one leader system. So well, I do not believe and I do not take for granted that China will outrun the U.S. economy. Of course, there may be a possibility, but I want to once again make it clear that I don't take this for granted. We don't know what will happen. And regarding the military space,
측면에서는 미국과 협력을
in all aspects, I mentioned that we need to cooperate with the U.S., but in terms of the military front, when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, this hostile military confrontation between the U.S. and China is something that we do need to prevent.
그렇게 생각을
And why do I take that position?
군사적인 차원에서까지 적대를 한다면
if there is hostility in the military front as well, what would happen is we will be seeing a recurrence of past history, the Russian-Japanese War, the
그 과정
Sino-Japanese war, and the Korean War. You can see that it all had to do with powers clashing surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and the Korean people had to suffer greatly in the process. And we may be seeing the same occurrence of such wars. So I think we really need to make sure that that does not happen. And it's important to make sure that the U.S. And the Americans understand the specificity of the situation, because they might not be aware of this. The reason why I say that is because about a decade ago, there was an international conference in Seoul. It was a closed session, and there were some key policy decision makers that joined the session. And one person was Stapleton Roy, who was a key advisor to Secretary Kissinger. And
대사를 했던 분입니다.
he also was the Chinese ambassador in the past, and already he is a renowned Chinese expert in the U.S. And what he said was the following. He said that as he was working for the Department of State for a very long period of time, he was also in charge of intercurrent diplomacy or Korean diplomacy. And he said that 80 to 90% of the policymakers
대해서 잘 모르는
weren't really aware of the geopolitical situation of the Korean Peninsula. So their view starts off from the Korean War. And any history or any background before that point in time, or the hardships of the Korean people, it wasn't well known to such policymakers. And he mentioned that if we do not better their understanding, it would be very difficult to encourage the U.S.'s support.
항상 하는 얘기는
So what I always mention and emphasize is that these core decision makers really need to understand our thought process. So how can we do that? I've always mentioned that this is something key and something that we really need to put in the effort. So once again, if let's say that on the military front, if we have China as a stark enemy, and if it's official, for instance, you can see the North Korean issue in itself is immensely challenging, but we will be hit with a double whammy with also China on the plate of the host of things that we have to resolve.
코스트 베니핏
So we really need to make sure that we calculate, or we really engage in a cost-benefit analysis to make the right decisions and to make the right choices. And then with regard to THAAD, Professor An and Professor Kim, Dr. Kim has also mentioned this point, but basically, as was mentioned by Professor An, I think that the thought it was inevitable. The U.S. is here to protect us, but
이 안전이 걱정이 돼가지고
due to their safety concerns
그이
and in response to the missiles of North Korea,
미국 사람
and that's why they want to put in a thought system, deploy the thought. And what would happen? I believe that the logical rebuttal here would be, we're here to protect you, but we want to protect our citizens, so what are you saying? So
시키지 않는 이상은
you can see that for the Americans, in their point of view, if we stop them from deploying the thought, it may not make sense. So I've actually mentioned this in a commentary in the past. So
포지셔닝을
it's important to make sure that we clarify our positions with China. So we do deploy the thought, and China,
사라지고 그럼
with your efforts, if we can actually if you reduce the threats of North Korean missiles, then we can actually get rid of thought. So that was the advice that I made for the government.
저기 대처를
So what I want to say is, so with regard to this relationship with China, I thought it was quite pitiful that we couldn't take this response at the time to clarifying our position that as long as they minimize the threat of North Korean missiles, we would be okay with
전략을 하는
removing the thought. And another question had to do with our position with regard to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I really think that we have to actively respond and collaborate. If we take the case of the Quad,
때는
during the Trump years,
시였냐면 쿼드라고 하는 거는
it was that Quad was a way to prevent China from increasing their military power. However, with the Biden administration, the Quad changed its concept. So it wasn't a military type of grouping, but it was a member, a country type of dialogue or network where it was about delivering public good to the Indo-Pacific region, whether it be vaccines or whether it be in response to climate change, technological cooperation. So it was a cooperative framework was what he mentioned, and that's why they have all of these working groups. So then, if that is the case, I think that Korea needs to actively involve itself and find a way to seek its national interests. So I think that this is an okay strategy, and I believe that it was last year or so where I also once again written a commentary on this, or an op-ed. So it's the same. Right now, I hold the same position. We really need to be active in the activities in the Quad. And Professor An talked about the supporters for the alliance or autonomy or national sovereignty. And as I was in the working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that very topic was the most grave and difficult topic, because you can see that this bifurcation, this black and white type of approach is an issue. It's about whether we choose alliance, or would it be about national sovereignty. So this type of logic, I think, extremely simplifies the situation, and it seems to be focused on a nationalistic type of approach, like the times when we were struggling for our independence. So I really believe that that's not the right approach, and I've asked the members of the press not to use that term. But unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears, because you can see that it's a very clear type of expression that would ring a bell for the readers. So they decided to keep with this term. But I cite the example of Germany quite often. They also had the conservative and the progressive. They had both the left and right. So, for instance, the Adenauer actually was pro-Western, that party. So France, UK, and these other democratic countries were important partners in his view, and he decided to focus on such a diplomatic strategy to be pro-Western world. However, Bill started to go towards the Eastern strategy, where it was utilized to improve the inter-German relations and also the relationship with the Soviet Union countries. So what does this imply? And what kinds of implications does this have? Well, if you look at this pro-Western strategy and the Eastern strategy, actually creates a synergy. It harmonizes, and that has eventually led to the desirable result of unification. So in the case of the pro-Western policy, George W. Bush has, of course, supported the unification efforts quite strongly. And the success behind this unification lied this Eastern policy as well. So through this Eastern policy that existed for more than 2 decades, actually was the key axis in unification. So you can see that Western Germany was at a very desirable situation, but unfortunately in Korea it's very difficult to harmonize these two stances. It's a confrontation between the two, and it's always a fight or a decision to make between the two. And in 1982, the Kohl administration, it was a very conservative administration. And at the time, this Kohl administration decided to succeed this Eastern policy. And that has made a great difference. And as Professor An has mentioned, I believe that strengthening the Korea's relation in some sense will help us encourage the North
이끌어내는
achieve denuclearization and also instill lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I really believe, as you've mentioned, would be that this can be the cornerstone. The alliance can be a cornerstone to make all of this happen. And last but not least, Professor Choi, thank you very much for your comments. And one last comment.
당국과의 구조적 제약을 우리가
The structural limitations of Northeast Asia coming from the U.S. and China competition, how would this, how can we break away from this? Well, objectively speaking, it would be very difficult to just do this alone. But globally, we do want U.S. and China to cooperate, whether it be denuclearization, whether it be the environmental issue, whatever it may be. We do not live alone, so they need to collaborate. So I think that we can take the initiative to find a way to bring them together.
행사를 할 수 있다.
And if we can wield such leadership, and if the new administration can make this happen, I think that that would be desirable to have these two countries cooperate.
하고 그러더라도
Even if we do see the struggle intensify between the two,
하기 위한 바꿔서 얘기
I think that
남북한의 주민들 간에 서로 통합을 향한
it's important to strengthen our energy, to integrate the people of the two Koreas. So we need to also push forward for that as well.
그리고 중국과의 관계
And also with regard to the relationship with China,
들이 북한을 기본적으로
I want to say that
지역으로 보면서 미중 대결의 맥락에서 자꾸
in it's true that in many cases North Korea is thought to be a factor in the U.S. China relations, but I think that it has to be separated in the discourse. And we need to mention to the U.S. and China that peace on the Korean Peninsula would be favorable for both two countries and also for China. I believe that mutual trust and reconciliation was quite weakened in the process, so I think that it's important to make that point clear in our diplomatic efforts, and we also need to be strong in our positions when we do respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoon. Is there anyone among the discussants who would like to add to this? I can give you about 30 seconds, but if you don't have anything you'd like to say, that would be even better.
그 노무현 정부의
Dr. An, under the Moonyoung administration, you were the foreign minister.
혁혁한 그런 그 공헌을 했다 한미 관계에서라고 하면 세 가지를 들 수 있다.
I think that there were three major contributions to KRINS relations at the time. Was first the dispatch of troops to Iraq, and then there was the KRINS FTA,
해군 기지
and then there was the
만들어질 수 있는 그런
Marine Forces base that was stationed in Jeju-do.
진보 정부가 아니고
If this had not been a liberal
정말 진보 정부의
administration,
헤쳐나가지 못.
it would have been very difficult to try to make these achievements possible.
마침 진보 정부였기 때문에
But because you were a liberal administration,
그런 저는
I think that we were able to
보는데
have these different achievements.
문재인 정부는
The current Moon Jae-in administration says that it has upheld the legacy of the Romean administration, but it has not been able to overcome these different challenges. I just wanted to say that.
감사합니다.
Thank you for that. We
약속해서 이제
are far behind schedule, so we now have to close.
저희들은 한미 수교 140주년을 맞이해서
We are here to discuss
관계가 지난 140년을 어떻게 발전해 왔고
how the KRINS relations have evolved over the past 140 years and where we must go forward in the future. To do that, we have to take stock of the current situation and see where we must go in the future.
한번 보시고요.
I would like to invite you all to take a read of the different presentation materials here. After May,
최대 외교 현안은 북한 문제가 될 것이다.
the DPRK issue is going to be the single biggest foreign affairs challenge for us, and this is what Minister Yoon has said. And for us to
미국과 중국 사이에서
overcome the situation,
성이 아니라
we have to engage not just in strategic ambiguity, but as Dr. An has said, strategic reliability between the U.S. and China.
위해서는 지금까지 우리가 발전해온 이 한미 관계
To
군사적으로
that end,
넘어서서
we
호관
have to go beyond
이렇게
the military alliance.
지난 30년간 달랭전
We have been able to evolve this into a comprehensive alliance, which is what we have done over the last several decades. Over the next few decades, we have to make it a more mature and sophisticated alliance so that we can respond to various global challenges such as the climate issue and the pandemic.
어떤 영향력이 있게끔
And we have to have a kind of global impact as a
국가로
partner in the noblesse oblige
그렇게 하기 위해
framework. And to that extent,
가치 외교를
we have to respect the values
국익과 더불어서 국가
diplomacy based on democracy and also look at our national interests but also our national standing.
산업혁명 잘 대응하면서 한미
Respond prudently to the fourth industrial revolution but also engage in military cooperation
중국으로까지
while
하는 문제에 있어서
overcoming DPRK. But when
이런 얘기를
it comes to targeting China, we have to be very prudent in that regard.
안인혜 교수님이 또 지적해 주신
Dr. An
한미가
has said that
요인이 될 수 있는 것을 우리가
we have to be very careful when it comes to looking at any situations
차기 정부가
that could lead to conflict. So, for example, the easing of sanctions. If the next administration works too quickly to try to lift the sanctions in an effort to try to improve inter-Korean relations, this could lead to more conflict between Korea and the U.S. So we have to be very prudent in that approach.
오늘 나눴습니다.
So this is what we have discussed today.
역사와 방향을 제시해 주신 윤영관 장관님,
I would like to thank Professor Yoon, Dr. An, Dr. Kim, Dr. Choi for all of your contributions today, as well as all the participants. Because of COVID-19, we were not able to have many people here, but we also have a lot of young people here in this room, surprisingly, and I hope that they will move on in the future as the future of our country. And as what Professor Choi has said, hopefully that we can all work together to create a brighter future for Korea, because you will be agents of unification of Korean Peninsula. And there are many people who are watching us online.
여러분께 다시 한번 감사.
Thank you very much.
함께 대한민국의 미래를 잘 만들어가는
I hope that we can all work together to create a better future
참
in Korea.
발표해 주신 모든 분들께
Thank you to all of our panelists and speakers. With that, we would like to conclude with an applause.
네, 유익한 토론 진행해 주신
Thank you very much, moderator and speakers
한번 감사합니다.
and panelists for your contributions.
정말 미주
And as I was listening to the discussion, you've mentioned that we're seeing in the competition between the U.S. and China for hegemony is intensifying. It's going to put us in a tight spot. But thank you very much for the ideas and the future direction for Korea. I can see that there are many scholars, experts here today that really engage in these discussions, and I believe that we will be able to devise the desirable way forward. So I trust your capabilities and efforts. So once again, thank you very much to all of our speakers, panelists, as well as our audience. And with that, let me close this session. We will take a short break, and from 3 p.m., we will begin the second session on sports. And I would like to ask for your active participation. Thank you.